We have the absolute pleasure of being able to interview Professor John Sweller, who over the last 3.5 decades has developed cognitive load theory. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. We have a lot of people who are very interested in cognitive load theory. Dylan William, who's the assessment guru within education, said that if teachers needed to know any one thing, it was cognitive load theory. So thank you for taking the time to be with us. Let me just start with that very simple question. What is cognitive load theory?
The essential beginning of cognitive load theory is human cognitive architecture. How we learn, how we think, how we solve problems. The theory sits on that base. So let me begin there and say a few words about human cognitive architecture. First thing I'd like to say concerns the categories of information that we deal with in classrooms, in schools, in any education and training institute. They're different to the categories of information that we deal with in the outside world. We often take the view, oh look, it's more or less all the same, and it's just that some of it's done in class and some of it's done outside of class. It's not like that. We invented schools, we invented educational institutions precisely because the information that they have to deal with is different. And if it's not discussed, treated, handled in schools, it tends not to be handled at all. The simplest example of that is learning to listen and speak, for which we don't need schools. People learn to listen and speak just naturally, without any effort, without going to school. We don't teach people how to listen and speak their native language in school. Reading and writing, on the other hand, is something entirely different. If we were to try to have people learn to read and write just by natural means outside of schools, nothing happens. And we know that because until about 150 years ago, almost nobody knew how to read and write. It required schools and the special procedures that we use in schools to allow us to learn to read and write.
I've heard you before describe this as the difference between primary information and secondary information.
Yes, it's often called biologically primary and biologically secondary.
The primary information would be picked up through experience largely, whereas the secondary information needs to be taught by an expert. So the assumption in that is that if it's secondary and we don't pick it up naturally, then it's hard to actually pick it up. So the question then comes, what is it about our cognitive architecture that makes it so difficult?
There are several aspects of it that we need to keep in mind. Let me begin by outlining working memory, which is a central aspect of cognitive load theory. Mm-hmm. Working memory is absolutely critical when we're dealing with biologically secondary information. It's absolutely critical. And it's critical for the following reasons. Working memory is extremely limited. It's limited in capacity. We can only process maybe 2, 3, maybe 4 units of information at any given time. Beyond that, working memory is overwhelmed. We can only hold information in working memory for about 20 seconds without rehearsal. If you have more than 20 seconds, it's gone. And we need to keep in mind that, firstly, this only applies to novel information we're not familiar with. You need to keep in mind that the whole purpose of students being in a class is to assimilate novel information. And we need to keep in mind when we're presenting that information That's the cognitive architecture that we're dealing with. It's not the case that some people have a very large working memory and some have a very small one. Pretty much the same for everybody, and it's very small for everybody.
Is there a difference between working memory and long-term memory in terms of capacity?
Long-term memory is the second critical structure of human cognitive architecture. Unlike working memory, long-term memory has no known limits. Has no known limits of capacity. We assume there are limits somewhere, but wherever they are, we don't know where they are. They're huge. No known limits in terms of time. We can hold stuff in long-term memory for years. The third aspect of human cognitive architecture that really needs to be considered, apart from working memory and long-term memory, and really the critical aspect, is the relations between them.
Okay, so just to summarise before we go on to the relation between the two. So in order to learn secondary information or novel, new information, it needs to go through our working memory, which is a very limited capacity, into our long-term memory, which has by and large an unknown capacity, but unlimited as far as we know. So that therefore has an impact for the classroom, which we'll come on to in a moment. But can you just then explain what is the relation between the working memory and the long-term memory?
Okay, we use working memory to take in novel information, and once we've taken it in, once we've practiced it, once we've thought about it, it goes into long-term memory. Then it can be taken back from long-term memory back into working memory, but this time, unlike when it first went in, the limitations have gone. And that transforms us. We become different people. As a consequence of having information in long-term memory, we can do things, we can think about things which we couldn't dream of doing until the information had gone into long-term memory. Once it's in long-term memory, we can bring it back into working memory, and working memory is transformed, and in the process of transforming working memory, we're transformed, which is simply another way of saying education transforms us.
So is that because, if you imagine we have 5 bits of new information that are presented to us in our working memory, we then integrate that into our long-term memory and then retrieve that back out of our long-term memory to work in tandem with the bits of new information in our working memory. Is that what you mean by now we don't have the limitations placed upon us?
Yeah, that's exactly it. If you're just learning how to read, first you're going to have to look at each letter and you're going to have to learn to recognise it. And then you have to learn to put the letters together to make words and words into sentences. And that requires all of your working memory. And in the process of using up all of your working memory, you may be lucky if you have sufficient working memory to enable understanding of the text. Once the ability to recognise letters, words, on the printed page, it's in long-term memory, we can start using working memory for other purposes. And the other purposes are, what does this mean?
So the reading process is a very interesting one, and I think it helps to illustrate the point very well, because you may have 5 letters which can be integrated into a word. That word goes into your long-term memory. That word can then come back out, be added to other words, and you can form sentences. And that retrieval process is how you then develop a very sophisticated reader over time. However, some people may mistake that and think, well, when you're young, like in kindergarten, then you have the problem with working memory and long-term memory. When you get to year 12, you don't have that problem anymore. But actually, that's not the case, is it? No matter what stage of the learning process you're at, when you are presented with new information, that is when you have to really pay attention to the load on a working memory. That's correct?
That's exactly it. And in year 12, you're being presented with a lot of new information, and you have exactly the same problem as a 6 or 7 year old child who's also being presented a lot of new information. It's different information, but it's new for that person.
So the learning process takes bits of new information, integrates them in the long-term memory, and then does that in a cyclical process to the point where a student has a knowledge map, or you can use all sorts of sophisticated words for it, but in their brain, which brings them into expertise in that certain area.
Yeah. And an expert is precisely that, somebody who has lots and lots of information in long-term memory that's been integrated, held together, and they know when I'm in this circumstance, in other words, I see this situation or I see this problem, this is what I do, this is how I do it, and they can do a lot of that unconsciously.
With that in mind, then let's move on to the classroom and how that would affect instructional design, and therefore that's why a teacher would need to know it when they are thinking about their instructional design.
Right. That cognitive architecture that we've just been talking about has been used to generate a whole range of instructional effects, and I'll talk about, I won't talk about all of them, there's a lot of them, but I'll talk about 2 or 3 of the more prominent ones. Probably the best known one is the worked example effect. And that simply says that if you want to teach somebody how to solve problems, give them a worked example. Get them to study that worked example. By problems, I certainly am talking about mathematics and science, but it's every single area. If you give a humanities student English literature or history an essay to write, you're giving them a problem. One of the best ways, and we've got data demonstrating this, one of the best ways is to show them, here's the problem, here's the essay topic, here's an ideal answer. Study that answer, think about it.
Okay, so our cognitive architecture means that we need to minimize load on our working memory when we are designing instructional techniques. One of the ways of doing that is to give them the model or worked example from the start.
Yeah.
So they don't have to sort of think in their mind, what exactly are you aiming for? You're telling them up front, this is what you're aiming for.
And the load on working memory is dramatically reduced by showing somebody how to do something as opposed to having them work it out for themselves. There seems, as far as we can see, very little gained by having students spend a long time trying to work something out which a teacher could tell them, sometimes, depending on the problem type, in literally a few seconds. You can see that most clearly in mathematics. You know, the student can puzzle over the solution to a problem. Curiously, nothing seems to be gained from that. We think, oh look, they're really working hard, they're really concentrating, that's good. But they're not concentrating on
the right thing.
They're concentrating on things which don't result in anything going into long-term memory.
So giving them a worked example or a model is a very key part of instructional design if we want to minimize load. What are the other pieces of advice that you would give to teachers?
Next piece of advice actually flows from that worked example effect. You have to design the worked example, which is another way of saying you have to design the instruction in such a way as to reduce working memory load to help the student transfer the information across to long-term memory. One of the other major effects that we have studied is called the split attention effect. If you have 2 lots of material And if, in order to understand the topic, you have to tend to both sets of material pretty much simultaneously, that involves you splitting your attention. The easiest example comes from an area like geometry. You might have a diagram, and you might have a set of statements. Angle ABC equals angle XYZ for such and such a reason. In order to understand that statement, which might be part of a worked example, it might be part of instruction that the teacher's giving in front of a class, in order to understand that, the student has to simultaneously concentrate on the diagram, and by itself the diagram doesn't tell you anything. Concentrate on the statements, and by themselves the statements are completely meaningless. The statement angle ABC equals angle XYZ is unintelligible unless you go back to the diagram. And you can see what the student does is what we all do in that sense. You go backwards and forwards between the two. When you're looking at the diagram, you've got to remember what's in the statement. When you're looking at the statement, you've got to remember what the diagram looks like. And what do I mean when I say you've got to remember those two? I mean you've got to hold them in working memory and mentally integrate them. And that act of mentally integrating, okay, angle XYZ, okay, that's over here. Angle ABC, that's over here, and they're equal for such and such a reason. That takes up working memory resources, and as we said earlier on, they're in short supply. Got very few of those, and it's wasted.
So when teachers are putting together their materials, they need to do the integration before the lesson so that the student isn't wasting time flipping from resource to resource, which is often what happens, and splitting their attention, overloading their working memory in a way that isn't actually leading to efficient learning gains.
That's that summarises it perfectly. The material should be physically integrated by the teacher first, so that the student doesn't have to mentally integrate it, because if the student's mentally integrating it, he or she is using working memory, and they should not be using working memory for that purpose.
So we've got the worked example, we've got integration. Can you give us another effect?
The redundancy effect, and I use the word redundancy in its widest term. It means anything that's really not needed. Possibly the clearest example of that comes from a lot of the educational websites that you see. The people who construct those websites take the view, look, I may as well put this in because it might be of use, and I may as well put this other thing in because it might be of use, and it isn't of use. It actually has a negative effect, putting in a whole lot of material which isn't necessary. Redundancy is one of the major problems we face when we're presenting people with information. If you're giving people information they don't need, they're not aware they don't need it. They have to
decide what's redundant and what's important.
It's another load on working memory, and the process of saying, oh, right, I went over this, I didn't need to go over that. And all instructions like that.
There's a number of effects, some of which you've outlined. If we think about as that process develops, we're bringing new information to students, and we're wanting to move them from a novice in that particular area of learning to an expert in that particular area of learning. What you're telling us about cognitive architecture is suggesting that we need explicit instruction, which is very aware of the impact on working memory and how our instructional design is affecting the load on working memory. As you move through the continuum, so as they have gained that information, integrated it, retrieved it, and gone through that cycle, moving from novice through to competent, let's say, or intermediate in a certain area of learning, and automaticity starts to come, so it moves from being very, very difficult to much more automatic. Is there a change in the way in which instructional design is affected?
Yes, and that leads us to the next effect that I'd like to talk about, which is the expertise reversal effect. You can give people information which is essential to them, and you need to present it in, say, physically integrated form so that you don't have the split attention effect. Mm-hmm. But as they become more knowledgeable, they may still need information, but the information changes. Let me give you an example from the worked example effect that we talked about right at the beginning. Mm-hmm. For a novice, you need to show them the solution to a problem, and they need to study it. Now, once they more or less understand it, it doesn't mean that they really have fully learnt it. They may still need to practice. But at that point, worked examples become redundant. Mm-hmm. Okay, I talked about redundancy effect. What might be essential for a novice may be quite redundant for somebody who's more expert. Yep. So what we find is that initially, with respect to the worked example effect, people will learn a lot more from worked examples than solving the same problems. As they become more expert, that difference narrows. Eventually you find there's no difference. It doesn't matter whether they study a worked example or whether they solve a problem themselves. As expertise increases, and it needs to increase, as it increases, not only does the difference disappear, it now reappears, but in the reverse direction. We find that people, rather than studying worked examples, ought to be solving problems. In other words, at a certain point, you're learning to write essays, you're learning to solve mathematics or science problems. At a certain point, you no longer need to study worked examples. You should be doing it yourself at that point.
So we've moved along the novice-expert continuum, we've hit intermediate, say. There's not an obvious line, but as they progress more to automaticity and have the foundations of knowledge in that particular area, they then need to be using more independent pedagogies, so more inquiry-based, more independent, more problem-solving. That is what's going to kind of take them on to the next level. And actually, if at that point we continue with explicit instruction or being so directed, we put a ceiling on their expertise, which is what the expertise reversal effect is about.
Yeah, yes, that's exactly it. It's a good thing to leave students to learn by themselves once they've reached a point where what they really need to do is practice and think about what they've learned. At the beginning, if you introduce that learning by yourself, often called inquiry-based learning, it is counterproductive. It is quite counterproductive.
And it's counterproductive because they do not have the framework or the knowledge map, the foundation for that to be productive.
And that knowledge map, that foundation, that's what a teacher is for. They're the experts, and they know how to present it, and they should know how to present it in a way that the students have the minimal extraneous load on their working memory.